I'm delighted to be asked here tonight to give a lecture on motivation and change, as it is an area I have a huge interest in and passion about, and it's really great to see the turnout because I can appreciate on a Monday evening how much it takes to get here. I often think people are funny, people at the best of times, funny creatures, but no more so when it comes to making changes. We seem to find it hardest to do the things we most want to do, and even end up getting in our own way at some times. But before we begin, and I think in her intro, Orla may have given me a slight promotion, but I am experienced in the area of motivational interview and counselling, but I'm yet to train, but we'll get there in time. But before I begin, I must clarify one thing, and that is that I am no expert. Like I said, I'm not an expert, and the reason I say that is I often think that people have it within themselves to make the changes they want and need to make. Occasionally we need a bit of guidance or a bit of space to step back to find a way to make the change we most desire. Often it's a case of figuring out what we want to do or what is important to us. The other piece I might add is that I'm used to working with people in groups, and I tend to learn a lot from the people I work with. I often think people know it within themselves, they just need a bit of help to find it. I suppose why I'm saying that tonight is that usually I'm used to talking with rather than talking at, so you may notice I am using my notes tonight to kind of keep me on track, because when I get interested about something and passionate, I do have a tendency to go off on tangents, so you might bear with me on that. So tonight, while I won't promise to give any answers, I do hope to reflect and provoke some thought on getting to understand what motivates us and also what gets in the way of change, so that we have a better idea of what is going on, particularly when motivations stay the same as strong as that to change. So what I hope to look at is increase our understanding of motivation, explore how we make change, how we find it, whether we seek it out and dread it, explore different types of change we may be facing, those we want or need to make, or those that are forced on us by life situations and that we're trying to adjust to. I'm going to introduce the idea of ambivalence. It's a fancy word, but really what it means is when we have mixed feelings about change, which I would say by and large is most of the time. I'm going to think about all of this in relation to mental health and recovery, and we're going to finish with working on a change plan. One common reason that people come to some of the groups I run is that they feel they lack motivation or are stuck with regard to one issue in their lives or in general. A frequent statement I come across is, I have no motivation. When we feel like this, we often don't know where to start. In such times, we come to groups or health professionals looking for the answer, with varying degrees of success, I might add. Now, it is not that people think I have a bottle of motivation that I've been keeping secretly in the back press, keeping away from them, but more often that when we feel stuck about something, we tend to perceive the answers as being outside of ourselves, and this is rarely the case. This can be for many reasons. Sometimes we can struggle to trust our own judgment, or when we are in a situation it is difficult to see what is working and what is not, and that it is only when we have space to step back that we can begin to figure it out. What I have found in my work with people in the hospital and in general, anyone who's trying to make change, is that one thing that people are not wanting for is advice. They're getting it by the bucket load. It seems to be our default position as humans is suggestion and advice. We have an urge to help, to ease distress, and generally to make things right. We tell people who smoke, drink, eat, work excessively that it is bad for them, as if they didn't know. Later on, I will be coming back to why we persist in habits that don't do us any favours. But I think it is fair to say that in general we have a rough idea of what is good and bad for us. But knowing this doesn't necessarily make it any easier. I developed the group programme I run along the lines of motivational interviewing. And one key principle I say at the beginning of each group is, advice and feedback can be helpful. And if you've experienced a situation, it can be useful to hear how you manage that for other people. But however, ultimately, each person has got to decide what is helpful for them or not and what's going to work. And sometimes the only way you know that is by trying it out. Now, before I go any further, having established that I'm not an expert at PowerPoint, I need to make a confession. Or at least, very least, I need to take the halo off that I'm busy carving for myself. Because while I work hard at this in work and endeavour to listen and understand first, I would be the first to admit I fall a little short of this at home. Now, thankfully, my husband isn't in the audience tonight, or he could give you plenty of stories. But, so it sounds very easy. It sounds very easy to listen, to try and step into the shoes, but it's not. And while I can do it at work, I have to say I fall far short of it at home. And the responses tend to range from frustrated, sometimes exclamations of exasperation, and at the best end, advice. To which my husband responds, "Is this what you say to your clients in work?" And I have to admit, no. So I think sometimes he gets the rough end of the deal. But I suppose why I'm saying this is that none of us are perfect. In fact, we're all human. And it affirms my original point, which is knowing the theory is one thing, translating it into practice is quite another. And I've been at this for some years, so I still have some way to go. And this, I think, sums it up. I first developed an interest in understanding and motivation and change. And the guys who did a lot of work in this were two guys called Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick. And they started out with why people don't change. They, like I could see people really wanted to change. Oftentimes that it was quite important as well. But not changing resulted in difficulties. And I suppose in this line of work, often not changing often results in admission. But still, neither of us were any the wiser as to what wasn't working. So as Orla said in the introduction, in my role as an occupational therapist, I explored the impact that mental health has on a person's ability to do what they need to do and want to do in their everyday lives. For some people, whether it's depression, anxiety, addiction, eating disorder, it impacts literally on what they want to do and need to do. If your concentration is gone or your sleep is gone, it's very difficult to function, and everything requires twice as much effort. However, for other people, they're coping, they're going about the motions, they're getting themselves through work, and they're meeting the needs of their families as best they can. However, there's little enjoyment or satisfaction in daily life. So, and I'm taking myself back to when I first started practicing, and I apologise to any of you that first encountered me, because I would do my best to listen. A person would come, present their problem, I would listen. And before too long, I'd prescribe about giving advice and outlining the solutions. If this was the first time the person was getting help, they were often delighted, or either that or they were being kind to me. But anyway, they often set about enacting the prescribed solutions. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. And some people were desperate, they just really wanted to try anything. However, I quickly realised this wasn't working as people came back, and I thought, well, we're both working towards the same thing, so what's happening here? And I suppose looking at the slide, it's not that I was the expert or that any health professional is the expert in their lives, but I was particularly horrified because I don't take advice well. Even when it's offered with the best intentions, and particularly when it's most needed, advice tends to irk with me a little bit. But most of us come with this inbuilt righting reflex, and that's the desire to make things right. And I better tread carefully here because I can see one or two of my colleagues in the audience. But health professionals are particularly notorious for this. We come in with a desire to help, and we think that giving advice is the way to do it. So often we offer suggestions, solutions and advice, and then we become perplexed when people still struggle with change. It seems like common sense. We want it for people, they want it for themselves. And whether they're our friends, our patients, or even our family, it sometimes leaves us wondering, what's the bit we're missing? And this was the exact scenario that led Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick to consider this further. The frustration experienced by watching others struggle are best summed up in the phrase, "you would think that." You'll notice I have adapted it for an Irish context. Typical examples are, you would think that having had a heart attack would be enough to persuade a man to quit smoking, change his diet, exercise more, etc., etc. You would think that hangovers, your marriage breaking down, or that awful car crash would be enough to convince Mary to stop drinking. You would think that staying in bed all day feeling depressed would do nothing for your confidence and that you would get up out of it, and so on. Now, in my work as an occupational therapist, and this is where I'll ask you to think a little bit about your own situation, in exploring with change with people, I tend to find that deep down most people have a fair idea of what they want to do and know what they need to do, but still struggle a little with change. So part of my work and part of this lecture is to reflect on what do we want and how can we go about getting it. If we end up getting in our own way, what are we doing in that? So sometimes it's quite useful to think about a typical day. Now I have left some of the exercise out the back, but even think to yourself how you spend your time from when you get up in the morning to when you went to bed at night. So just take a moment and do that. Would you say you're satisfied? And then what, if anything, would you like to change? And the first place is to think about meeting our needs. What I'm going to ask you to think about for a moment are 3 concepts of motivation. The first one being desire. Often when we think about motivation, this is the bit we think about. We think about really wanting something, being excited or energized by something, or of an opportunity. Sometimes, however, the change is not something that we want to do, but it's something that we need to do, so therefore it's quite important to us, and that can reflect core values. Other times, a change can be something that's really important to us, we really want to do it, but we're lacking confidence to make it happen. And if that's the case, then we can often find ourselves a little bit stuck. Confidence can be low for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's your past experiences. If you have had limited past experiences of success, your confidence or your belief in yourself that you can do it will be a little bit lower. Sometimes it can be due to depression or anxiety, which really steals confidence like nothing else. Sometimes it can be feeling overwhelmed by demands on you where you actually don't have the capacity to think or can't envisage. So what I'm going to move on to now is change, thinking a bit more about how we experience it, the stages of change as we go through it. But I'm also going to think about these 3 concepts, desire, importance, and motivation, in relation to them. So when we think about change, it is important to consider, do we seek it out and look forward to it? Or do we avoid it, dread it, avoid it at all costs? Is it change we want or need to make? Or are we dealing with change not entirely of our choosing, adjustments of one sort or another? I think this cartoon reflects quite accurately that sometimes desire can be low. And I was thinking about the irony of standing up here giving a lecture on motivation and change when Kate tried to persuade me to use the hospital laptop earlier and I resisted it. And I thought to myself, that is interesting in itself. Sometimes it's change that is important to someone else who may be important to us. This could be anyone from your wife, your doctor, your friend. So sometimes you want to do the change, but not necessarily for yourself. You kind of want it because someone else wants it for you and you think it might be good. That can lead to a bit of a tussle. Or sometimes in life, and I'm going to come to this in the second half of the lecture, we're dealing with change that's not entirely of our choosing. These are the kind of situations that really we have no control over, but they require change on our part, and they're often some of the hardest to manage. But I'm often struck by, in the people I work with, the amount of resilience and the capacity for change, but I would say with support in order to meet those. The last thing I'd ask you to think about is confidence. How confident are we in making the change? If we aren't that confident, we might not be able to tolerate even thinking about it. I don't know if those of you can do down the back and see this cartoon, but basically it's a person weighed down by, I can't do it, I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, there's definitely no room for mistakes, I must be perfect. Other days, and this can change within the days or the week, we can feel quite optimistic. Usually this can fluctuate between one day, quite a lot from one day to the next, or even within the same day. When I first started doing this training, Brian Foley was one of the people I worked with, and I'm still training with him years later. But we were asked to think about our own example of making change. I can't remember the exact details of the exercise now, but I think we were asked to reflect on a time where we made a change and went about it. Somehow or another, we were asked to consider other people in it, what they did that helped or didn't help. Anyway, my example at the time, and this is going back years, I naively thought I had it sorted then, was smoking. I remember thinking back to my then boyfriend, who is now my husband, strong encouragement / nagging, we could call it that, to give up. He hated that for reasons that I came to understand later, but then I didn't even think about that. However, the more he went on, the more indignant I became. It was my right and choice to smoke, how dare he? On good days, I'd respond with, I'll give them up, just not today, I've got too much on, or this week, or next month. On one particularly bad day, I came out with, if he wasn't happy with my smoking, maybe it was the relationship that wasn't working. That is how important cigarettes were to me back then. Bearing in mind I married the man, there was a question of priorities, but maybe I wasn't able to think about that then either. However, as I was doing this exercise on the course, I began to think, well, when did I shift into this determination to carry on smoking till my dying days, literally, to wanting to change? And I realised it was around the time that he stopped nagging me. When I was given space to think about it, he just left me to it. So it was around Patrick's weekend, and I just decided I'd had enough of having him out like an ashtray. I had enough of being broke. And I thought, I'll give it a try now when no one thinks I'm doing it. Because if I've learned one thing from the work, there's a huge amount of pressure. If you think of something that is really important to you, and smoking might not be the example of the change, but you might really want to do it deep down. Sometimes the more other people want it for you, the more pressure you feel. So I thought to myself, I'll try it now when nobody's looking, literally, and see how I go. That way I didn't have to face the shame if I was back on them a week later. However, I stuck at it. The one thing I remember was other people's comments, and one of them was the kind of piece, aren't you great? And I found that really difficult because I remember thinking, that's a pure judgment on how I was when I was smoking. The other people were the reformed smokers, and I know there are some of you in the audience, but you're zealots. I haven't quite turned that bad myself. And I know I'm not easy to please. But where this relates to the point that I'm trying to make is that when we argue for change, we can actually have the opposite effect on the people we're trying to encourage. And I thought in Newton's laws of motions from physics, when you exert a force on one body, you're met with the second body simultaneously exerts a force equal and opposite magnitude. So if we go one way, the other person goes the next. And that is something to keep in mind, both with yourselves and with others. But there's a quote by Blaise Pascal, which I thought summed it up nicely. And it's people are generally better persuaded by reasons they've come to themselves than by those which come to the mind of others. Now, I'm going to ask you to think yourselves about a time where you made a change. Anytime you see Garfield, you're going to have to do a bit of work, so I'm warning you now. It can be as far back as you like, or as recently as you want. And it can be as big or small as you like. But I just want to take yourself back there for a couple of minutes. How did you go about it? And what was motivating you? And literally, if you want to go back 20 years, do. If you want to go back last week, do. But I am going to ask you to hold this in mind, because when I go through the stages of change model, I find that it's most effective if you can think about it in relation to a change you're either thinking about making yourself or have made in the past, because it tells you more than I ever could about how you work through change. And that's what I like about this approach. So I'm just going to give you a moment on that. Some of you may be familiar with the stages of change model by Prochaska and Di Clemente. They started off in 1983, they made revisions to it in 1994, and I think Di Clemente, I don't know what happened, Prochaska, made some more revisions in 2003. Pre-contemplation, so kind of up there to the very left of the lightest blue arrow, is that stage before we're thinking about a change. Either we have no notion of changing, we're happy out as we are, or we're just not thinking about it. We may perceive no great need to change, and we might not know what the fuss is about. Or in some situations, it's not that people don't want to change or haven't thought about it, but if it doesn't feel even remotely possible, you're not likely to try or not likely to be able to tolerate a thought of change for very long. So what I'm going to try and do just to kind of make this real, and this is where group is kind of useful, is people give their own examples of change and you learn a lot from each other's. But if we take an example which might be current or one that most of us could relate to, it's thinking about changing a job. So if you think about pre-contemplation in relation to changing a job, either you're very satisfied in your job, or else you feel you've no other options and you might as well stay there, and that could be for any number of reasons. But change isn't on your horizon. Contemplation then is when we begin thinking about a situation. Often we can see the good things and the not so good things. This isn't necessarily an easy place to be, because once you start thinking about change, it's quite difficult to go back. Often we want the desired effect to change, but we don't want to let go of our habit. Generally, change happens, if you were to think of decisional balance, when the not so good things begin to outweigh the good things, or the cons begin to outweigh the pros. So if we think of our example of a job, contemplation might be where you start thinking about getting a new job. Sometimes it's prompted by what's called a consciousness-raising event, and that's a fancy term for something that makes us think. So sometimes it's that you get an experience to do something new and you really like it, and you think, oh, I wouldn't mind doing a bit more of this. Sometimes we're prompted to move away from the situation that we're in. So, for example, maybe you got on really well with your old boss, but the new one is a disaster, you're in constant conflict and you feel like they're picking on you. So you have the job section of the internet or the paper out. Often we can spend weeks, months, or even years in contemplation. And this is particularly true of addictive behaviour. It doesn't mean you won't change. It doesn't mean you're any less successful in it, although those around you can get very exasperated by it, particularly if it's alcohol or substance use. It's also true of relationships. And I think I was struck when I was doing this presentation of the number of phrases Irish people have for ambivalence. The phrase, they're off again and on again. We've all heard that. And basically that is a kind of state in contemplation where you're not really that sure about the change. You kind of go with it, go back to it, and kind of it can be there for quite some time. When we think about the example of the job, the difficulty is that the more we move towards option A, the more option B seems really attractive. We begin to anticipate difficulties. And in my work, it's one of the reasons I know people are actually thinking about changes when they start going, oh, but, and you can hear the list of things because they've already imagined themselves doing it. Whether it's joining an aerobics class or going for a job interview, they're beginning to think, actually, what would this be like if I'm doing it? As we kind of move more towards that, we can begin to get anxious. And if anything paralyzes, it's anxiety in terms of motivation. It just freezes the ability to think. So the doubts creep in. What if we weren't any good at it, didn't like it? Maybe it's a mistake. Often when the benefits of change outweigh the distress in making it, the closer we move to that new job, the better the old one looks. And a classic example of this is your last day in your old job. You begin to think, these people are lovely. The pay wasn't so bad. I was kind of good at it. What am I doing? And doubts creep in, and that's how we work. Preparation is when we begin to take steps. At this stage, and this is why I'd like to emphasise, this is not a linear model. It's not one that you go through and come out the other end. You can be in preparation and still in contemplation. You can have one foot in one and one foot in the other. So preparation might be finding out information about a gym. It might be looking up Irish jobs. It's taking steps. We dip in our toes in it. At action stage, it's where we begin doing. And in terms of making change and motivation, this stage is really important because thinking about it, in fact, overthinking it, can actually have the opposite effect on your confidence. If you do it and you have the experience of doing it, it's really important. You've got your foot in the ladder, and then it's about taking the next step up, moving one step outside your comfort zone. Often during this stage, people let other people know what is happening and look for support in making these changes. So if we go back to our example of the job, it might be submitting a CV. You call to interview, you have another choice then, do you take it or not? Sometimes it might be signing a new contract or handing in your notice, and which order you do them is up to yourself. But that's more committed. Once people have succeeded in maintaining or keeping the changes over a certain period of time, they enter what's called the maintenance stage. Now, I find this stage really interesting because there's much debate in the literature about when you can proclaim when you've entered maintenance and how long you have to be there to say that you're in it. Basically, maintenance is when you no longer have to work so actively at it. It kind of becomes more of a habit and you feel more comfortable in it. Some of the literature, depending on what model or frame of reference they work from, will say 21 days. I'm kind of sceptical about that, given how long it's taken me to make changes in the past. Some people say 6 months, and other people say you have to work at it 1 day at a time constantly, that you can never take your eye off the ball. But I think, and this is only my personal opinion, most people get to a stage where they're pretty comfortable with it. It becomes automatic, it becomes a little bit easier, and you don't have to think so much about it. And I think that's how you know you're in maintenance. Now, I'd love to say it ends there, but it doesn't. Sometimes our motivation shifts with time. I go back to my example of cigarette smoking. The consequences aren't so bad anymore. You decide to have the odd ones socially. Again, another Irish phrase, "Oh, sure, what harm would one do?" And this is where we start. When we relapse, we often go back to the stage of pre-contemplation, contemplation. In fact, we're there whether we know it or not. The task is to go around the wheel of change rather than getting stuck. So some people get a bit demoralised, and often if you were to look at contemplation, it sometimes looks a bit more like this. You go back and forwards, it is a bit of a whirlwind. And I think, people get really demoralised when they've worked really hard to make a change. They put a lot of themselves into it and they find themselves what they feel is back at square one. And I often think you're not. And that's what I like about the approach motivation interviewing. It actually says that it takes more motivation to come back each time. It shows that you really want the change. And that's really what makes lasting change. So for those of you that can't see it, it's a space hopper of some description. And it occasionally requires this, which is literally bouncing back from mistakes. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about ambivalence. This is when we have mixed and conflicting emotions about something. It's the experience of being torn between two lovers, feeling pushed and pulled in opposite directions, or feeling betwixt and between, again another Irish one. It's when we want it and we don't want it all at the same time. There's another phrase when you're in a tiz. It's actually quite a difficult place to be, but for some reason we can stay there for ages, and that's why taking the step often in preparation or action brings you a bit of relief. What I'm going to ask you to think about now for a moment is different types of situations, because sometimes change involves choice. So what I'm going to look at first is what's called an approach-approach situation. This is win-win. It's when, there's no real bad option. It's been torn between two equally attractive options. It's often known as the kid in the candy shop scenario. It doesn't necessarily make it any easier to make a choice or a change. So when you think about it, if you've ever bought a new car or tried to decide with a group of people where to go on holidays, you're not really going to land with anything bad, but it can still take a lot of time to make that choice. The next one, however, is the opposite. It's avoidance, and it's what's commonly known as between a rock and a hard place. Clinically, it's known as a dilemma, because either option exerts distress. We've got anxiety in it anyway, we've got anxiety if we do nothing, and we've got anxiety if we make a change initially. An example of this, and I suppose it's more common these days, is a person who finds themselves having to make a choice that they don't necessarily want to make. So an example of that might be finding yourself that you're thinking about selling your house because you're in debt. So option one, I suppose, is you sell the house, you leave a family home that you love and that everyone is very attached to, but you may afford yourself some more financial security. Option two is you stay in the house, you also stay in debt. So this is the kind of situation where there are no easy answers. However, the option of staying the same isn't that easy either. And this is one of the ones that requires a lot of support. In recovery, the anxiety exerted by change often gets easier with time. It does. I was thinking later I'm going to come to using a ladder and figuring out how we set goals between where we are and where we want to be. And I remember someone saying to me lately, well, I just want to do it without anxiety. And I was like, that bit is impossible. And that's the hope, that we would get better or be perfect enough to be able to manage that. But it's being able to tolerate the anxiety, being able to get it wrong, and it does get easier with time. The next one is approach avoidance, and this is one really that coined the title of the lecture. It's what happens when your sweet tooth says no, and your wisdom tooth says no, even your sweet tooth says yes. This is special potential for staying stuck, because you've got pros and cons, pros and cons. Miller and Rolnick cite Billy Ray Cyrus's lyric, "I'm so miserable without you, it's almost like you're here." And I think it captures it nicely. Then you've got a beauty, which is double approach avoidance, where you've got maybe 2 or 3 options on the go, and you've got to try and make a decision. Which way do you go? Both have powerful positive and negative aspects. And I suppose sometimes the more important change is, the more we can struggle to make a decision. If something doesn't matter to us that much, we'll just get on with it without thinking about it too much. But I think it is quite important to weigh up the pros and cons, and those can shift, so it's important to spend some time at it, and I'm going to come back to how we might do that later on. However, I really like this cartoon because for me it summed up change nicely. That sometimes even the process of making it, we inwardly can have doubts or struggle with change. And for those of you that can't see, your man that's floating above the desk is, "I wasn't even hypnotised, I heard every word you said." So it is a bit of a seesaw, and later we'll be coming back to how we weigh this up. But for me, the one that summed up ambivalence best was this cartoon. Me, ambivalent, well, yes and no. And that's how it is. When I was talking about change earlier, I was thinking about the situations where the change is not of your choosing. You had nothing to do with it. And most of the time we experience change as stressful. This is primarily related to our need to stay in control. We all have a certain amount of need for familiarity, structure and routine. Most of us don't like change. I used to think I loved it. I only liked to change of my choosing when I thought about it. When we look at stressors in our life, and the next one I'm going to look at is guys called Holmes and Rath back in 1967 did a life stress inventory. Some of them are anticipated life stressors. They're the kind of changes that all of us will go through, some if not most of them in a lifetime. They can be both positive and negative. They're usually life transitions, such as leaving school, getting a job, going to college, losing a job, getting married, in-law troubles, getting divorced, becoming a parent, retirement. Then there's the unexpected life events. These are the traumas, the shocks and the tragedies, bereavement, loss, illness, that of yourself or someone else. In their social readjustment scale, they awarded each of these a number of points according to the value. And I suppose most people know that unemployment, death, illness, they're all negative things and they're incredibly stressful. They're kind of the old reliables. But often what we don't realise is we don't respond that well really to positive change either. Most people don't realise that certain change we would view largely as positives: holidays, retirement, moving house. Even outstanding personal achievement is on the list. I thought to myself, you can't win. But marital reconciliation as well was another one, can be equally stressful. So when we're thinking about change, we can use 2 types of skills to manage it. One is problem-focused coping skills. These are the things that we can break them down and make them manageable. You kind of step back for it. Often you do need the support of someone else to manage this one. You break it down and you look at the task. What can you do or what someone else can do? Focused coping skills are required when we can't change it. There's nothing we can do. It's absolutely outside of our control. And if it's a loved one that's sick, we'd do anything to take it off them, but we can't do that either. So then we have to work with the feelings and process what it brings up for us. I suppose the essence of what I'm trying to talk about is make it manageable. Because as you can see from the goldfish there, it feels like too much sometimes. So it's beginning to think about how we can break it down and make it into more manageable steps for ourselves. Now again, Garfield is back. So I want you to take a moment. Now this exercise is out there in the back if anyone wants it. But I want you to think about if there was nothing getting in the way, nothing at all, no obstacles, what would your wish list for change be? What would you really like for yourself? It can be in next week. It can be in the next 5 years. I just want you to think about it for a moment. If you got pen and paper, jot it down, but keep it in your mind. If you're particularly have great concentration, you might think about where you are with that change: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, or action. But perhaps for the rest of you, I'll get you to pick a change that you feel two ways about. You kind of want it, but you're not sure. This exercise is what's called decisional balance. So I want you to think in relation to your own change, the status quo. So say you were to change. What are the good things and the not so good things about it? And I'm just admiring my IT skills because I've actually put this diagram in reverse. But anyway, we'll start with the good things first. What do you get out of it? And they're not necessarily things that are good as such or advantages. But I'm a firm believer that every habit, we have it for a reason. It meets a need at some level. So when you think about the good things, what are they? When you think about the not so good things, when you're done looking at those lists, think, is there anything else? Now, I'll probably ask you not to look at the slide because the slide is in reverse, so it just confuses things. Number 3 is, I want you to think about the change you're thinking about making. When you think about it, what is difficult about it? What would the not so good things of making that change be? Might be quite a long list. And what are the positive benefits? Why would you want? If you got this change, what would it look like? What would it feel like? I often think people in audiences like that get away a lot easier than people in groups, because people in groups then have to share their examples. But you're going to get off a little lightly tonight, and I'm just going to take one perhaps that a lot of people think about. So if we think about exercising, the good things about not exercising, think how attractive your couch is. It requires very little effort. The couch is comfy. You don't get cold, you don't get wet. And that's probably about as much as I can think about. The not so good things is maybe you feel lethargic, you're low in energy, you kind of feel guilty, because the trouble with change is once you start thinking about it, you don't enjoy the couch nearly so much. You might be thinking about how unfit you are. And someone might be nagging you to exercise. Maybe some blood tests came back that weren't great, and that's all you hear about. So you're like, maybe I'd do it just to stop them. Then if you think about what's difficult about change, and I'm always struck that you can never make assumptions. Things that we assume are easy are not. Often the person who might love swimming might not want to go because they feel really conscious about their body. So therefore they have to get out walking before they can go swimming, and they hate walking. So that's quite difficult. Or often if you have a circle of friends that either don't like doing anything in their spare time, you might have to go on your own, and then that means meeting a whole new group of people. So sometimes you can really want to do something, but it's just not that easy to get started. And I think that is the key of where support comes in, is how can you make it a bit more manageable for yourself, a bit workable. Then you think about, and I find when people get into this area of thinking about what the benefits of change might be, they remember a time where they did it before and they thought, God, I felt brilliant, I was really fit, I bought new clothes, and I enjoyed it, and it was great for my mood. So the way this exercise works is as different as every person, each of you are sitting in the audience. But what it does, I suppose, is helps you to step back. Now, with decisions that have a lot more emotional resonance for us, we can still be a bit conflicted. And sometimes the list of items in the boxes doesn't necessarily reflect their importance. So if you are interested in that, and the exercise is out the back, it's fairly self-explanatory. You rate each item, 0 to 10, how important it is to me. You try and not give them all 2s, you try and not give them all 8s, but sometimes it can help you figure it out. And if it's a decision, and this is what I do with people I'm working with, if it's a decision that affects your family or someone you're living with, get them to put their bits in a different colour. And it's interesting how it can sometimes help you get unstuck and realise where the other is coming from. So when we think about motivation and change, we think about it in relation to recovery. And this diagram, which is from my colleague Jane, and it's not a great image of it, shows the different stages of change in relation to recovery. One of them is pre-contemplation. And this is often the stage in recovery where you're quite ill. The thing is that at this stage you may not know you're ill. What you may notice is that everyday tasks are requiring twice the effort, that you're lacking in energy and motivation, that you're not looking forward to anything, and sometimes even dreading most things. You may have begun to withdraw from loved ones, and you may not want to see sight nor light of them, really. You might be very confused with little hope that things can get better. At this stage, you may not recognise that you have a problem, let alone be considering change. And it's really difficult. And you can see that's the first figure to the left in the diagram. If we think about the mountain as recovery, you're not even looking at it. It's not in your horizon. And at this stage, sometimes symptoms can be so full-blown, it is really, really difficult to even think about change. I think everything is really difficult, full stop. A close friend of mine who experienced a severe depressive episode, when she had recovered, she kind of likened it like this. She said it was like being down a well. She said she could hear life going on around her, and she knew people were there, but their voices were faded. She said occasionally you could hear people calling down the well to her. Now, she recovered and she did well, but that experience wasn't easy. And that's a little bit like what pre-contemplation is like. Now, usually in my experience, people pull out of it. Often the first step is they talk to someone they trust, and that someone can be anyone. But often it's someone that they really trust, because when you're experiencing that difficult, we're quite proud. We don't want to let people know that things are difficult or getting on top of us. Sometimes that person is a friend, a family member, or a GP. But at this point, there's a glimmer of hope that things can get better, that change might be possible. But in the early stages of recovery, this is not an easy place to find yourself, as you may know you need to change, but it can be really difficult to hold the hope that recovery is possible, or the belief that you can take the steps needed. And sometimes actually, my experience is we need other people to hold it for us at that stage. It can involve stepping out of your comfort zone. Now, when I say comfort zone, I don't actually like that term, but you'll see the second figure there, if you can see it, has a question mark and a kind of decisional balance. Because this place is by far from comfortable, but it is familiar. And familiar can often feel really safe. In this place, particularly if there's clinical depression in the mix, you may not feel like you have the energy or hopefulness to consider climbing a mountain. So it is kind of hard to get started, and it is taking a risk, because a lot of people think it's been difficult. If you're feeling reasonably well again, you don't want to rock that. Preparation is where you begin to take steps. It's often the stage where you begin to feel a little bit better. The kind of phrase where you hear, come back to yourself. It's beginning to think about what you might need to do to recover. It's the stage where you're building on coping skills and supports. Often as you progress, there's initial relief as you start enjoying things again, you start feeling like talking to people, you start kind of getting some motivation back. However, this is quite closely followed by anxiety, because we always think about, it's very difficult to see where we come from. We tend to see where we should be or feel we ought to be, and you begin to think about returning back to work or how you'll cope with your kids or discharge. You'll note, if you're looking at the mountain, and bear in mind recovery is viewed as being on the other side, that from any of these early positions, pre-contemplation, contemplation and preparation, you can't see over the other side. Now, I don't know how many of you have actually climbed a mountain, but you'll be familiar with that point where you think you're near the top and then you realise you've another bit to go. In fact, sometimes you're only halfway up. And then it's even harder to motivate yourself, to be honest. Sometimes what helps with actual mountains rather than metaphorical mountains is if someone has been up there and told you the view is beautiful, or if you've been up there yourself and you know that it's worth the climb, that'll keep you going. But if you haven't, it's kind of difficult. Or then there are those of us that climb Croagh in bad weather and we're doing it for the experience because we're not going to see anything past our feet when we get up. In recovery, It's the same in recovery. Unless you've been through the experience previously and recovered, you may have to trust in peers or health professionals who hold that belief for you. Often one of the challenges and one of the things that is quite difficult about mental health is sometimes we can be left where we're barely recognisable to ourselves. And when you experience intense emotional states, it's quite difficult to imagine being any other way. And one of the other pieces is it that the people I work with, they have amazing competencies, capacities, skills, loads. But when you can't connect with that, it is quite difficult. So often that is, I think, where supports come in. Because one of the exercises that I asked you to do when you think about how you made a change in the past, or anything that you've done that you're proud of, you've still got those skills, resources and talents within you, and you can use them again. But sometimes if we feel really stuck, or we've gone a few times trying to make a change and we're getting nowhere fast, it can be quite difficult to see that. Of course, sometimes it's not possible to envisage fully what the future holds or what change would look like. And sometimes I'm not sure if we'd want to. I had hoped to do a piece tonight on personal values, but time isn't going to allow me. Personal values are composed of beliefs and commitments that define what we see as good and right and what we find meaningful. At different stages in our life, often if you ask people what their 5 most important values are, and I'm just going to throw them up on the screen, and then if you look at where they spend their time or where all their energy goes, they don't really reflect on their core values. And the one thing I would say is that sometimes if we're living our life or spending our time on things that are completely incongruent with our values, we end up kind of dissatisfied, discontent, disillusioned, or sometimes downright miserable. But sometimes life is really busy, and at different stages of your life, you might be just holding it down with work and family, and you don't really get a step back. People really like this exercise, so it feels like a little bit of a teaser, I'm afraid, sticking it up. But it's not an easy one, because it asks you to sort through 83 different values and think about which ones, if you were to pick 10 out of them, would be most important to you. Then it asks you to think about how you spend your time, basically how you live your life, and which ones do you feel you're living out or not living out as fully as you'd like. And I suppose the other aspect is sometimes values conflict with each other. You might really love risk and adventure, but if you've got a family, that's probably not going to work too well together. Some values are things that we're constantly trying to strive towards self-esteem, self-acceptance, self-knowledge, openness, spirituality, hope. Often one I find that comes up on a list that was never on the list before is health. And often, I suppose, we don't realise what's important to us until we lose it, really, I suppose. So what I'm going to think about now is, if you think back to that change, so pick one that you're kind of in preparation or action about. Literally what you want to pin it down to is, what change do I want to make? Why do I want to make the change? What are the reasons? If you were to break it down into steps, and literally this plan is out the back and it looks a lot better on paper than it does on that slide, what do you need to do? And set yourself a time frame to do it by. Who could help you with the change? How could they assist? And who do you go to for what? And when we think about supports, whether it's in mental health or in our lives in general, there's a wide variety of them. There's professional support, there's friendship, there's emotional support, there's practical support. I suppose deep down, some of us have an innate need, most of us have an innate need that people would know what we want and know what helps. They don't, nor are they going to. None of us are mind readers. So it is important in recovery and in life that if you want someone to help you, you've got to think and let them know as diplomatically as you can what helps and what doesn't. And then it's thinking about who you go to for what. That for some people are amazing at practical support, but when it comes to emotional support, they don't get it. And they're probably not going to, but then others of your friends or your circle may be really good at that. So it is really important, because it can be really difficult if you come forward with something that you really want help with, that you're feeling vulnerable in making a change, and then the person doesn't know how to help. So it is about thinking about who you go to for what. And sometimes you need the help of professionals, because some of the work I do with people, I certainly couldn't do with my friends or family. The next bit is, and this is particularly important if you have thought or tried to make this change before, what are the obstacles? What might get in the way? What got in the way before? And how can I approach it differently? And then the last piece is, how will I know my plan is working? And I suppose just to come back to where I started on desire, importance and confidence. There's an exercise involving rulers, and it literally is 0 to 10. Is this change something you're really looking forward to, you're really excited about? That's a 10. Is it not, you're dreading it? Or is it someplace in between? How important is the change to you? Is it not important at all? Or is it really important, like one of the most important things in your life? And your confidence. Are you not at all confident? Not. Or completely confident? 10. Or somewhere in between. And if you are a bit stuck with change, that'll really tell you what area you need to work on. And it is about taking steps. It's if 10 is the top of the ladder, 0 is the bottom, and you're on 4, what's the next step that takes you a little bit out of your comfort zone? And that is how you know you're working. And it's that kind of anxiety that kind of spurs you on a little bit. However, the one thing I will say is, if importance is really high, anxiety tends to go up as well. And when anxiety goes up, confidence goes down. So it's about being able to take a deep breath, get the support, and try it in manageable bits. Because sometimes, particularly if we've high expectations of ourselves, and quite a lot of people do, or a harsh inner critic, most people do again, it's about making it manageable. So I'm going to leave you with a thought, or a few of them tonight, or I will if I go the right way with these PowerPoints. Up here is a list of characteristics. As I read them out, I want you to pick 2 or 3, no more. Brilliant if you get more, but just pick 2 or 3 that you kind of identify with. Accepting, affirmative, assertive, bright, committed, courageous, diehard, effective, flexible, happy. Active, alert, assured, capable, confident. Creative, diligent, energetic, focused and healthy. Adaptable, alive, attentive, careful, concerned. Decisive, doer, experienced, forgiving or hopeful. Adventuresome, ambitious, bold, cheerful, confident. Dedicated, eager, faithful, forward-looking, imaginative. Affectionate, anchored, brave, clever, considerate. Determined, earnest, fearless, free, ingenious. Intelligent, knowledgeable, loving, mature, open. Optimistic, orderly, organised. Patient or perceptive. Persevering, persistence, positive, powerful, prayerful, quick, reasonable, receptive, relaxed, reliable, resourceful, responsible, sensible, skillful, solid, spiritual, stable, steady, straight, strong, stubborn, thankful, thorough, thoughtful, tough, trusting, trustworthy, truthful, understanding, unique. Some of us could claim that, all right. Unstoppable, vigorous, visionary, whole, willing, winning, wise, worthy, zealous, or zestful. Have you got 1? Maybe 2? 3 perhaps? These are a list when they studied change, and they've been doing it since well beyond the 80s, but in the last 30 years they've been doing quite a bit. There were characteristics of successful self-changers. So I suppose if I was to say anything or to leave you with the thought tonight is, change may not be always easy, but it is possible. So if you ticked 1, 2 or 3 of them, if you got 10, you're well on the road. You have the capacity for change. And I suppose I'm going to leave you with a few quotes. One of them is, things do not change, we change. Advice is what we ask for when we already know the answer but wished we didn't. And the last one is by Emily Dickinson, which it's been brought into my groups. And I really think when we're thinking about mental health, this one it holds a lot. It's hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So on that note, I think I will stop talking. I have covered some, but not all of what I had planned. So we're going to have questions in a few moments. You have, I think, sheets to write them down, and I'd love to hear them, and I'll answer them as best I can.